All right, so by this point, you should have enough knowledge to kind of start building out a multi-page application with maybe rendering out all the DOM elements from data, okay? So what we want to do at this point is we need to start extracting the data to come from a backend, okay? So we're going to dive into building out a really simple backend using Node.js and Express.js. And we are going to try to just return this hard-coded lists of posts to the front end, and I'll show you how to do that. So we're getting into more complex topics with this whole series, so make sure you pay attention and make sure you understand what we're doing and what we've done in the past. All right, so at this point, we are going to start using something called the terminal, which I did kind of talk about briefly at the introduction of this. And the terminal is a way to basically run commands on your computer without having like a user interface. So using the terminal down here, I could like delete folders, I can make files, I can actually edit those files. You can do a lot in the terminal. And one thing that we can do is basically run a program called npm, right? So Node Package Manager. Now what this tool does is it allows you to basically download dependencies from the internet and put them directly in the folder that you're working in. Now the reason we're doing that is because there's a package out there called Express.js, which you can use to quickly build out backend applications. There's a lot of others out there. There's like Sail.js, there's Nest.js, there's Happy.js, but Express is the one that most people use. It's the most bare bones, it's the most simple to get started with, and that is what we're going to try to do in this tutorial. So I would definitely recommend that you check that you have npm installed. So if you type npm --version, it should print out a version number for you. And just to also verify that you are on the same node version as I am, I'm going to type in node --version. So I'm on node 14.16, and this is my npm version. So if you're following along in this series, I would at least recommend you have node 14 installed in the latest version of npm. Inside of our terminal down here, we are already in this folder, full stack tutorial, and you can verify what folder you're in by typing pwd enter. And that'll print out the full path of what this terminal window is actually like navigated into. If you wanted to dive into different folders, you could just type cd, and then I could type the full path of whatever folder I wanted to. So for example, I can do /images, and that'll take me into that images folder, which happens to be located here, okay? You can also cd out of a folder. So if I do cd ... that'll take me up a level. And now I'm back at the parent directory, which happened to be this folder here. All right, so you don't need to know too much about that right now. Just make sure that you're in this folder. Whatever folder your VS Code's open to, make sure you're in that folder, which typically the terminal will open by default to that location if you're using VS Code. So let's go ahead and get started with npm. So I'm going to do npm init -f. And that'll create a file locally called package.json. So if we look at this file, so after running that command, this will create a package.json file. So if we open that file up, you'll see that this looks very similar to a JavaScript object. And because basically it is, other than the fact that all the keys have to be double quoted, like you have to put strings for all the keys and properties, this is basically a JavaScript object. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And this syntax is basically what we're sending to and from the server all the time. So just understand that this is just a format that we use to communicate between clients and servers. And luckily for us, since we're using JavaScript on the front end, we already have a good understanding of this structure. All right, so what does this file do? It actually describes the dependencies of the project that you're working on. And it also has a lot of other things that we're not going to talk about. So the most important thing to kind of talk about is that this package.json file contains all your dependencies, right? So let's go to npm.com or npmjs.com, and you can actually search packages here if you want to. So I could type like Express. And when you do that, it'll take you to the Express project. And typically there is an install command that you can copy. I'll just go ahead and click that. And then I could just paste it right here in my console and press enter. All right, so that's going to fetch the Express package from the internet, and it's going to put it in this folder called Node Modules here. So you can also see that there's a ton of other packages that were kind of included, and that is just because Express.js is built off of other open source libraries and modules, right? So the important thing to notice here is that we have an Express folder, and that is basically what we're going to be pulling into our code. All this might seem a little daunting, but really it's pretty simple to pull it into your code with a require statement. All right, so if you look down further in the documentation for Express, they actually give you a snippet that you can use to host an application. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste some code. And we are going to make a file at the root of our project. And you can put this wherever you want. I'm just going to put it here and call it index.js, or I can call it server.js. It's really up to you. So I'm going to make a new JavaScript file called server.js. I'm going to paste that code in. So at this point, we have code that should host up a fully functional Express service. Now we just need to run it, okay? We have the package.json set up. We have the dependency of Express set up. We have a file we can run. So how do you run scripts using Node.js, right? We haven't really talked about Node yet. Node is just a runtime that you can basically feed it JavaScript files, and it's going to run the code that's in the JavaScript file. So it's very similar to like a browser, where a browser downloads JavaScript files and reads through them and runs them. Node is the same thing, but you can run it on your laptop outside of a browser, right? You don't need a browser to run Node. Just its own standalone JavaScript interpreter, basically. Remember before we verified that Node was installed and it printed out a version. Now what we can do is we can type in node space, the name of the file, which happens to be server.js. You press enter, and that is going to run your server, right? Nothing's printing out down here, but if you notice that there's no it's just a yellow little box here it looks like it's stuck. It turns out that this is actually running the server. What we can typically do is I'm going to add a console log here, and I'll say server started on port 300 or 3000. All right, so let me do Command C and cancel that and rerun it. All right, so it says server started on port 3000, and I'm going to just show you that. So if I load up my browser and go to localhost 3000, you'll see that it printed out hello world here, okay? So we have a server running on port 3000, and now I need to walk you through how this code actually works, because you haven't written any type of Node code before, hopefully, at this point. So the first line is basically where we load in that Express module or library from that Node modules folder. You remember here, I went in here, and inside this Express folder, there is a index.js. And I believe when you do require Express, Node behind the scenes is going to dive into that Node modules folder. It's going to find the folder called Express, and it's going to grab whatever the top level file happens to be. I think it's index.js in this case, but it could vary depending on the module you're using. So when you run that command, that's actually going to return you a function that you can call, okay? So that's why we're putting that into a variable called Express. And then we are calling the Express function. We already talked about functions. This is a function that we call to get back a module. This is a function we call that happens to create a application instance in Express, right? So just bear that in mind. I'm just using some terms here, but we've already seen all this syntax before. Behind the scenes, this Express function is going to return you a object. And this object happens to have a bunch of properties on it, right? It has like a get method, a post method, a delete method, etc. And we'll talk about those methods in a bit. But what you can do is you can start setting up routes to your application, and then you could have that route basically call a function and execute some code. And then later on down here, we just start our server. So to show you what I mean about routes, I could change this instead of get slash, I could do get like hello. And now if I were to restart my server, just remember that you have to restart your server every time you make code changes. There's a library we can install to make it do it for us to automatically restart, but we won't get into that just yet. So if you notice here, if we go to the base URL and refresh, we get a cannot get slash, okay? And that is because we changed the path that's required to hit this function to be slash hello. So hopefully you can understand that means that we go here, we can type in hello, and we'll get back that hello world message. So what that allows us to do is we can actually split our application into multiple routes and do various things, right? I can make another route called like, I'll just say bye, and that could just return the word bye. So now if I restart my server, and then if I go to hello, we get hello world. If I go to bye, we get bye. All right, so hopefully that all makes sense. We're just defining new routes, Those routes call different functions, and those functions return some data. Let's talk about these functions, okay? We haven't really talked about that. I'm going to change these to fat arrows just so it's easier to understand. And I'm going to change this back to the default slash. So this get function takes in 2 arguments. It takes in the route that you basically want to listen for, and then it also takes a function, okay? So this is just a function that you can declare somewhere, right? I could just go here and call it like fun if I wanted to, and I could just pass it in here. Remember we talked about like inline anonymous functions in a previous video? That's basically all you're doing. You're just binding an endpoint to a function call. And inside of this function, you're given a rec and a res as arguments. Okay, so when the browser makes a request to the base URL, we are going to get a request object that has like all the data that's related to the request, such as like any type of headers, what type of browser the user might be using, a lot of other stuff. I'm not going to get into it. We'll see it later. But then we also get a res object, right? The res object allows our express service to basically return data back to the user. So in this case, we're saying just send back a string that says hello world, and that is why we're seeing this show up in our browser when we hit that endpoint. So one thing we can do instead is, instead of returning a string, you can return JSON, right? So JSON, if you remember, we just showed you what JSON was inside of this post array, right? So this is basically a JavaScript object. And we could return that from our backend if we wanted to, right? So instead of saying res.send, I'm going to do res.json, and I'm going to send back an object that has like name of hello world. Let's see if this will do what we want it to do. So I'll restart my server here, refresh the page, and notice that we get back a JSON object, which happens to have a name property with a hello world as a value. Okay, so I hope you're starting to see where we're getting to, like how you can connect the dots, where we need to get a backend that basically returns all of the blog posts in our application, right? So if we were to do that, we could first of all change this endpoint to posts. I'm going to restart my server so that we can hit /posts. And now we want to return an array of all of our post data. So if we were to go back to this posts here, and I'm just going to copy this whole array, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste it right into our server call. So right here, we'll send back all of that. Go ahead and minimize that. I hope by this point you kind of understand what we're getting at, right? So now if we refresh, we actually have a backend server returning all of that data to us, right? So what that allows us to do is now on our front end, we can request that data dynamically whenever we want and then render out our application. All right, so instead of having to do all this and have it hard-coded in our UI, we could fetch it whenever we want from our backend. All right, so let's try to do that. Again, we're going to kind of cover some new topics that you might not have seen before, such as promises. So just keep in mind this might get a little confusing. All right, so let's go back to our UI, right? We have this index.js file, and when our application loads, we want to basically do a request to that backend server and try to get all the posts back. All right, so instead of hard coding posts here, just get rid of that. And what we're going to try to do is we are going to make a request to the backend. So it turns out that there is a function built into the browser now called fetch, and you can use it to fetch data from an endpoint, right? So I could say fetch, I could pass in a URL. So I'll do HTTP localhost 3000, and that happens to be the same URL that we had here. And we need to do a /posts, okay? So once you do that, let me just show you what's going on here. If I refresh the page, you will see that it tried to make a request to /posts, but it actually ended up failing for some reason. Now, the reason it's failing is because there's a security thing set up in a browser that doesn't allow your browser to hit endpoints that don't match the same domain, right? So I think since we're loading from a file, that's one issue. But also, this is hosted on port 3000, and our browser is not accessing something on port 3000. So the browser says, hey, like, your scripts are doing something that it probably shouldn't, so it doesn't allow that request to go through. So at this point, we have to go back and we have to set up another library on our Express service called cores, right? So if I search cores here, there is a Node.js cores module that we can use and kind of put it into Express. All right, so let me just go ahead and install this. I'll copy it, paste it in here, and save it just like we did before. We already know how to install modules. And then what we can do is scroll down in the docs because they probably tell us how to use it. And they will tell us right here that we need to first require it. So let's just copy this require code here. I'll put const cores is equal to that. And then we're going to say app.use cores somewhere between after we make the app and before our endpoints. So again, what's going on here? We are calling a method to bring in the cores module. The cores module happens to return a function, which is why you can see us doing cores parentheses. And when you call that function, it's going to return a function, and we're going to pass that function in the app.use. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on here behind the scenes. Either you just know how to do this, or you understand that we're calling functions that return functions, and we're passing that function into another function, and that's setting something up. But the important thing to kind of talk about here is app.use. Okay, so app.use is a way to basically put functions, and we call them middleware, that are kind of executed before your endpoint functions are called, right? So this is going to be executed before your request function is executed. And what cores does is basically sets up a couple of headers in your browser so that it allows different agents or different browsers from different URLs to hit your endpoint. So I know it's a lot, it's kind of confusing, but it's just good to know about. So if I were to refresh the page now, you'll notice that there's no red in our console. Actually, let me clear it and redo it. There's no red down here in the network requests. And if we were to look at posts, and let me expand this. If I go to response, you'll see that we get back 3 objects, right? We got back 3 post objects, and that's exactly what we saw when we hit that URL directly here in our browser. All right, so that's good. We got some data back. But now the question is how do we actually use it? Okay, so if we go back to our front-end JavaScript, we need to talk about something called promises. So I would honestly recommend that you watch a lot of videos about promises or go read up on them, because what I'm going to explain here is not going to make it click. No one can, I don't think anyone can really understand promises if they're new to programming the first time they learn about it. But I'm going to try to teach it anyway. So when calling the fetch function that's built into your browser, that is going to return something called a promise, right? A promise is just a fancy way to say an object that has a then function attached to it and then a catch function attached to it. All right. So behind the scenes, this is what the fetch function is going to return. It's just an object that you can do .then. Remember, if you want to access a property on an object, you do a .then. And that then function is going to take in a callback function, right? So that's going to take in like a response as an argument. And I'm going to say response.json and just go ahead and do that. So because the promise has a .then that you can call, basically the argument that your callback function is sent is whatever this happens to return, right? This happens to resolve some type of object or a function or a value. And to access that value, we need to do a .then on it. Now, the whole reason for using promises, again, is because this is an asynchronous function, right? So the whole idea of asynchronous code is that we need to make a request to that backend, but that could take like 5 to 10 seconds to resolve if we're on a slow internet connection. And we don't want the rest of the code to stop executing just because we're waiting for a URL to finish resolving, okay? So what we can do is we basically write asynchronous code, which is going to set up something called a promise that is going to resolve down the road, okay? So we call this, and what the debugger is going to do is continue to step through our code, and then at some point, the backend is going to return our data, and our browser is going to go back and kind of execute this part, all right? So if we wanted to put a debugger here, that could hopefully help us understand what's going on. I'm going to put a debugger in the if statement. And what I'm going to do is show you, if I go to my index.js, you'll notice that it kind of stopped right here inside of this .then callback function. And the response has a couple of things on it. It has like a body. It has some prototype methods called like JSON and text. And what you can do is take that response that came back and call the JSON method on it to basically get back the array, right? You can get back this array that we saw earlier. So let's actually do that. Instead of returning, I'm just going to say const posts is equal to that. And I'm going to go ahead and put a debugger here and show you. All right, so if we hover over posts, you'll notice that posts is now a promise as well. All right, so it's kind of confusing that we have a request that returns a promise and then the argument has a method that returns a promise. So what you need to do again is you can do a .then on this. So let me just go ahead and refactor this a little bit. And we can say posts like this. Put the debugger here and I'll console log posts. Let's refresh the page. And now you'll notice that if we hover over posts, we get back an array that has 3 posts in it. So all this code, again, like I said, like you're not going to understand promises the first time. They're kind of confusing. Now, another crazy thing about promises is that whatever you return from a promise, you can actually chain on another .then and grab that value. So instead of having to do this like callback hell is what they call it, we're having to nest like a .then inside of a .then. What you can actually do is return response.json from the first promise, and then you can attach a .then to it like this to access whatever happened to be returned from the other promise. All right, so this is going to return the array of posts, and then this .then is going to console log those posts. So if I go back to my console here, clear it out, you'll notice that we get an array of 3 posts. Again, this is super confusing. It's going to take some time to understand. And what we're going to do is, let me refactor this a little bit to keep it a little bit cleaner. By the way, something I don't think I talked about, the fat arrow function, if you just write it without curly braces, it's going to return whatever value this happens to execute for, right? So this function is just going to return the JSON array, and then this .then chain is going to basically print it out. Quick thing I want to talk about, there's also a .catch function that you can basically use, and that would be useful if there's any errors that happen in the backend, like you make the request and the backend happens to crash. You can actually print out those errors here and do different things in your application if that happens. But again, I already showed you a lot about promises that are probably super confusing, so let's not dive into that. But hopefully at this point, you should be able to connect the dots, because now we actually have an array of posts. And we need to re-render those posts onto our page over here, which we've done a lot already in the series, right? So if we wanted to render out those posts, instead of running it down here where post happens to be undefined, if you notice here, there's post isn't defined anywhere in this code. And that is why we're getting a post is not defined exception. But what we could do instead is cut this code out and put it where we have the posts. All right, so let me just go ahead and save that. And now we see that we get all the posts rendered out into our application. I'm going to do a really quick recap, because this, I think, part of the series was probably the most confusing, and we learned a lot of different things, right? So we learned about how to use npm to set up a package JSON file. That file just tells others what dependencies our project depends on. If you see here, it has a dependencies object that has cores and express. And we can install modules by doing npm I space the module name. And when you install them, it happens to bring the module into this node modules folder. And now inside of your node code, you can actually require those modules here and start using them, right? So we require the express module, we require the cores module, and we basically just started setting up an express service. We set up something called a middleware so that we can actually access our API via Chrome tabs that aren't on the same domain. We made a function that is going to basically be invoked whenever we go to /posts here, and that function happens to return a JSON array using the res.json function call. And then we set up a route called /posts, which calls that function. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do it like we normally do it in Express and just put that whole function there and collapse that if we want. And then we printed out a console log and we started our server on port 3000. And now if we go to our UI, we refactor that to basically make a request to the backend to get that post data. So if you see here, we did a /post request. We got back 3 posts, and those posts were basically fetched here using the fetch method. We did some promise chaining to get back the actual posts array. And then we basically just did all of that logic that we did in the past video in this series to basically loop over all the post data, create a new post component, and inject it into the page. All of this stuff is super important to understand. Let me emphasize that this is like the most important part of this whole series, because we do this all the time, right? We always fetch data from the backend. We have to basically do that in an asynchronous call using either promises or async await. And then once we get the data, we need to dynamically generate some HTML and put it on the page, right? We do that all the time, whether you're using React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, Vanilla.js. Like this whole paradigm of fetching data and putting it into the DOM somehow is done in every web application that's super complex. So watch this video if you really need to, because you need to understand the full stack connection of how like the front end talks to the back end and the back end returns data and the front end actually like injects that data into the page. So I think next we are going to keep on building upon the server to make this no longer return a hard-coded array of posts, but instead maybe grab those posts from a database like Mongo. All right, so stay tuned for the next video because that's going to be fun to learn as well.